Well, hey, this is Carrie, and it's my pleasure today to talk with you about spirituality and psychotherapy. In the article that you read, you know that I have a guest here today, and we were going to do an interview with each other, but as it turns out, the film was faulty and we cannot salvage it. So I will do the best I can to let you know what Drew Nagy said. Drew Nagy is a pastor here in the Westover Hills community and the director of a community center. And I am going to let him introduce himself. And so as I did that, I found him in a very contemplative mood with his hands folded, and I will tell you a little bit about what he said. He first talked about how difficult it was with a subject like self-discovery to introduce himself, and that it was something that he would be telling you more about what he does than who he is. And he says he is a pastor, but that's what he does. He said he is a beekeeper, and that's what he does. He's an organic gardener, but that's what he does. And then he said perhaps of all the roles that he loves the best, it was taking care of Naya. And Nala is his dog, and he says he's very, very much in love with dogs. So I remember coming from Ithaca, New York to Richmond, and for years going to Unity Church. And while we were there, we always thought of seeing the Christ in everyone. And in one of the books that I'm going to read to you right now, there is a wonderful dedication, and it's of the book to the man's dog. And his Richard Rourke is his name. He's a Franciscan monk from the Center for Action and Contemplation. And he is writing this book on the universal Christ, which is something kind of controversial in his circle. But he says in the dedication, I dedicate this book to my beloved 15-year-old black lab, Venus, whom I had to release to God while beginning to write this book. Without my apology, lightweight theology, or fear of heresy, I can appropriately say that Venus was also Christ for me. So how touching and how exciting it is to have someone so in love with the Christ. His first chapter says that Christ is not Jesus Christ's last name, that Christ is not Jesus's last name, and that we find the Christ in so many ways. And one of my very favorite articles is written by a woman who is called Kit O'Malley. And she says that her current belief system is not limited to a Christian viewpoint, though she does love Jesus's love and forgiveness. Never have I ruled out other religions or secularism, for that matter, as valid and valuable belief systems. Honestly, if you seek the truth and love, you're going to be going in the right direction. I am open to any explanation of or definition of a higher power, whether it be scientific, nature itself, consciousness, or whether it is some Western monolithic concept of God, or Eastern religious or philosophy. For simplicity, I use the term God because it is more universal. Turn my cell phone off. So this is a woman who has had experiences that we will be talking about in a moment. But first I want to ask Drew to respond to me on the level of what he sees as the meaning of spirituality and self-discovery. So he begins to kind of take delight, first of all, in the section of the Universal Christ that talks about dedicating the book to his dog. So Drew is pretty happy here, as you can see. And he, in this question that I asked him about what he sees in the question of self-discovery and spirituality, he says it's very important, for one thing. And he begins to say that there are so many books written about, there are so many books written about self-discovery, and there are so many books written about the spirituality of self-discovery. And he says many of them are ancient and go back centuries and centuries into what we would call the mystics of Christianity and Judaism and other faiths. And he says that one of the things that he knows about self-discovery is that it is an ongoing journey and an ongoing process. So I just wanted to talk about the mystic aspect and to tell you about a book called The Bipolar Advantage. And in that book, this writer says that while he was manic, he had conversations with God, correspondence with God, and experiences with God. And that when he took his medication adjustment and became non-manic, that he still validated those experiences with God. And the article in here by Kit O'Malley talks about her various experiences with God when she was manic. She was diagnosed bipolar and had experiences directly with God in her manic states. So we look back at the mystics, and she considers herself a mystic because a mystic is really someone who has had direct experience with God, as opposed to being taught or having traditions. And she is very much considering herself a mystic and validating, even when she's out of the manic episode, the correspondence that she had with God when she was in it. So we look back at the mystics centuries and centuries ago, and some of them were burned at the stake, but some of them became saints because of their direct relationship with God. And so we can begin to realize that many of those people were considered to be eccentric. But today, if you talk with God, you're considered to be mentally ill. So we have a little bit of a difference between biblical times and now in terms of the concept and regard for someone who has experiences with God. So it's just something to think about and to be aware of as we talk about mental illness and visions and hallucinations and those kinds of things that tie us up with God and with angels. Just the thought. Now, I asked Drew if he would make some comments about his general thoughts about the relationship between self-discovery and spirituality. And so here he is, very animated, you can see, and he begins to talk about the Big Bang and talks for quite a while about that, and indicates that we may even be still in the Big Bang. So after he gets through doing that, he goes into another subject and says maybe we are the ecosystems, the human ecosystems. And so I had to, after he talked about that, look that up on the internet, because I really didn't know what that meant. And it basically means that we're connected with the environment and climate and changes and those kinds of things. So I began to think about things that had to do with spirituality, and that what made someone come close to God. And I thought about the quotes that we have come up with about that. There's St. Augustine that says, "Grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I may know thee." So there's a definite correlation between know thyself and knowing God. And in this book, which is sort of the mainstay of our study, it's called The Gift of Being Yourself by Benner. And he talks about the sacred call to self-discovery, and that if you are able to follow that call, you may even know what your vocation is. So he talks about having to know yourself to know God, and having to know God to know yourself. And in chapter 5, he has a whole chapter on unmasking the false self. And in there he says, everything that is false about us arises from our belief that our deepest happiness will come from living life our way and not God's way. So it's interesting. It's an interesting concept of living life God's way and getting underneath what in the back of the book one of his followers says is the crust of the ego and the images that hide the truth of you. So it's very important, I think, that we kind of go back to one of our earlier sessions where we talk about the images that we portray of ourselves, and that we realize that we are really needing to get underneath that ego and begin to be our true self. Another thing that this writer, Benner, talks about is the dual role of meditation and contemplation and being quiet, and the actual belonging and getting together with other people. And he says no one gets very far on the path of spirituality without two things: space for contemplative reflection and engagement with others who share the journey. I've already invited some of my former friends to go into a period of reflection with me and to ponder with me. And you might ponder on this, what you are reading. So I think that this book is worth getting, and it's a certainly a fabulous indication of what the false self is. It's one of the better versions of the false self. I, because of those two things, asked Drew to talk about the monastic way of life, and he began to be very happy to talk about that. And he said that it's very important to him that he spend time in contemplative prayer and meditation. And I would just like to say that the church has had some real blows in these last centuries and these last decades, and the idea of contemplative meditation and mindfulness is not always found in connection with the church. It's sometimes found in connection with recreation centers and different community organizations. But Drew goes on to talk about the monkhood of all of us. And he says that every time he has a vacation or gets a chance, he goes to a monastery and is very still. And we know from the Bible that it says, be still and know that I am God. So I think that that's very much a part of Drew's life. And he indicates that that's about him. That's about him. And we will be expecting great things from our community center that is located in Westover Hills, because that is a place that is interfaith. No one is pushing Christianity on anyone, and it is a place that is in the cusp of three communities that the hope of the center is to unite into some sense of belonging. So I asked Drew to talk about the future of self-discovery, and he contemplated and said that, like the Apostle Paul says, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And he basically was saying that we cannot really fully know ourselves in this lifetime, and that someday we'll be face to face with ourselves. And perhaps this is something like the Johari window we talked about in session 1, 2. And it is where we have that fourth window where we don't know something about ourselves and others don't know about us. And that may be just exactly what kind of thing that Drew is talking about here. And it might be the kind of thing that Paul was talking about when he was writing that verse. And the verse comes from, try to get this right this time, I recorded this before and I got it wrong, comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And it's a beautiful, beautiful beginning to that chapter, which talks about faith, hope, and charity, which means love, and that the greatest of these is love. And of course, we know that the Bible very clearly states that God is love. So as Drew begins to contemplate about the various ways of becoming aware of yourself and aware of your spiritual journey, he indicates that it is definitely a journey and it is not a destination. And we often hear that phrase that half the fun of it is getting there. Well, in the spiritual world, it's very important that you start and you journey and you don't look for a particular awakening all of a sudden, but that you have a lifelong transformation. And he says this is the journey, and remember the journey. So I'll end there, and I want to say that I appreciate Drew being here in pictures. And as Drew leaves, he always makes a pose. Whoops, that's not the one. That is not the one I want to show you. I think this is, though. I took these pictures off of the video that we couldn't use. This is the way he folds his hands. And it's like this. And he says, Namaste. And that means many things. And it can mean goodbye, peace, hello. But it is a sign that is very familiar to us who know Drew. And it's certainly a characteristic of his in his ministry and in his community center life and in his everyday life. So thank you, Drew. And for you, I will see you next week with a different topic. Thank you.